What's up, everyone? Today we are going to be talking about how to create a budget for your nonprofit organization. The budgeting process can be very nuanced, it can be very tedious, but you should not be operating or running your organization without one. And as we are, approaching year end, many of you are in the thick of getting ready to start your budgeting process, or you might be in the thick of actually doing it. And if so, I hope that this video is going to be helpful. So keep watching. So let's set the stage. You first want to gather any necessary information that is going to be needed to actually complete the budget. So you want to think about what are the revenue and expense needs of the organization, and do you already have committed funds to help cover any of that, right? Because that's going to be your starting point. Is there anything that's carrying over, or is there anything that has already been committed to the organization that you can depend on? That's going to be our starting point. You'll also want to have your budget to actuals from the prior year, or maybe even the prior 2 years, because it's good to look at what happened historically. Now, while you won't completely just roll forward what happened in the past, a lot of times when you are determining where you want to go, it's good to see where you've been, right? Because that helps give you an idea of what the organization has done in the past. That can help kind of guide what will happen in the future. So make sure that you have that handy as well. Next, you want to determine who needs to be at the table. The budgeting process is not something to be siloed. It is something that is meant to be collaborative. When I was a part of the budgeting process, when I was an in-house controller, we made sure to not only have like the executive director at the table, but also the department heads and the operations manager, because it was important that they were able to provide input. There was things that the property management director was going to have that I wouldn't be privy to, or the individual program directors, right? There are things that they know about their individual programs that I may not be privy to, and we want the budget to be comprehensive, right? And we want it to be as detailed and as accurate as possible. And so all of these people that are necessary need to be at the table so that we can create the budget together. Who needs to be at the table? And then finally, you want to set your goals and your assumptions, right? So, what are the programs that you're going to be running? Are there any new initiatives? What is the organization trying to accomplish in the next year, right? That helps to set the stage for what you're trying to build. And you need to go into the budgeting process having that in mind, so that when you are testing the estimates and the assumptions that you're coming up with, you want to make sure that it is actually supporting the goals and the mission of the organization and what you're trying to accomplish over this next 12 months. That's the basics, right? That's how we set the stage. Now we want to actually get into the nitty gritty, and so I'm actually going to take you over to my screen as I walk you through the way that we help clients create their budget and walk through this process. Okay, so here we have a random budget. Please don't hold me to the calculations and some of the specifics. I just wanted to give you guys an example. So I tried to kind of block certain things out and, change names and things like that. So if you see something that doesn't make sense, 9 times out of 10, it probably doesn't. As far as like you see director of XX, right? So first we want to start with the revenue. You want to identify your organization's revenue or funding streams to determine what your starting point is. Now you'll see here, for example, it says July 1 starting cash balance. So we're assuming that this organization, right, is on a fiscal year. Sometimes your organization may end the year with funds left over, right? Maybe you didn't end in the negative, or you didn't end like completely zeroed out, but maybe you have funds that are getting carried over. You need to identify what those funds are. Do any fall in general operating? Are some very specific, like you see here, to, individual programs? Whatever the case may be, what are you starting with, right? And then you want to identify what are the different streams that you're expecting funding from. So here you'll see these are some, some things that I threw in here. You have some coming from specific programs, right? Or you have some just coming from regular general operating that you can expect and kind of spend how you want. That's that for revenue. You also want to identify if there are any funds that you're expecting but haven't been committed. If you end up with a gap, you may be able to depend on those funds. So you want to just keep that in mind as well. So then you want to go down to your expenses, right? So what are the fixed expenses that you can expect and kind of plug in? What's variable that you can estimate, or can you look back at historical numbers to kind of come up with an idea of what you spent in the past and can estimate for the current budget? Are there any new expenses that you're expecting and that you now need to account for? Can you get quotes? Can you look up what is common practice to pay for these different things? You want the budget to be as close to accurate as possible, understanding that these are estimates, things can change. And that's why it's not a set it and forget it. You got to make sure that you come back and you're looking at things, you're reviewing, and you're updating as needed. And you also want to make sure that if you are having any kind of in-kind donations given to the organization, that you account for those as well. So just to give you a little example here, you have expenses that we've kind of grouped by categories. So you have personnel, right? So who are the different people we're going to be paying? Are any of them supposed to be allocated to individual programs? And this is where having that expense, that cost allocation plan is going to come in handy, because you need to determine, are staff supposed to be allocated to any one program? Is that salary or those salaries covered by specific funding? Because that plays a part into how you plug it into the budget. Or are these people just supposed to be paid with general, operating, money, because you need to make sure that you got enough unrestricted funds to cover that person's salary if it's not covered by specific, programmatic funds. Identifying who are all of the people, the roles that you're going to have to pay for, building those out, allocating them to the appropriate program if that is the case. Your fringe, so what are those, benefits that you're paying, the fees and the taxes that are associated with your salaries? Are there any contractors that you're paying? So are you bringing in any consultants? Like here we have the audit firm. So we're assuming that this organization has to be audited. And so that audit firm is going to prepare their audit report in their 990, right? What is the cost for that? For anything that is just, maybe miscellaneous, but we want to account for, they may fall into that other category. And then you want to think about your admin expenses, right? Any professional development, postage and shipping, bank fees, any, licenses you're paying for, utilities, supplies, things like that. And remember, this is specific to this, organization. This is just an example, but you want to make sure that you're combing through. That's why I said it's important to have your prior year's actuals, just so that you can see what categories you have spent in the past, to make sure that you aren't forgetting anything. And so it needs to be specific to you. And that's why even when you get a template, it's just a template. It's just a starting point. It has to be built out to be specific to your organization. Some random program expenses, travel expenses. And when we say program expenses, this is also something that you want to really, really pay attention to, because each program typically also has its own budget. Now, we are not going to get that deep, right? But just so you know, that's why you see other tabs too, right? So we have tabs for each program, because then each program has its own budget, which feeds the organization's overall budget. And so it's important to know, how much does it cost to run this thing? Does it make sense to keep running it, right? And so the only way we know that is by looking at the numbers. And then we also have the allocation tab, which breaks out how we even got here. How did we determine, what the amounts were that went to program 1 versus program 2? And this is why it's important to have that cost allocation methodology, because if ever asked, you need to be able to speak to how you determine where these people are allocated to. So very straightforward. Again, if you are not a new organization, you should be able to lean on some of those historical figures, that historical data, to help guide where you want to go. But of course, what this doesn't consider is, what are your goals? What are the new initiatives, new programs that you're going to be running, right? What are the new expenses that you are anticipating? Like, how does this here support where the organization is headed over this next year? That's what you need to solidify, right? That's what needs to be determined, so that these numbers make sense. Okay, so we walked through an example of what the budget could look like and some considerations and things that you want to keep in mind as you're building out the budget. And remember, that's just one way to do it. So if that way doesn't work for you, then you may want to find another way that does. But I hope that that example did help give you an idea of how you can begin to create your organization's budget. Or if you already have a process, maybe take some things away from this process that could help enhance what you're already doing. Now, once you have the budget created, the next thing you want to do is document, right, where those numbers, calculations, and assumptions came from. You want to make sure that you have a reasonable basis for how you determine the estimates, or if some of those numbers were actuals, right, they're fixed. You can easily say, this is where I got that from, but you always want to make sure that you have something to refer to that helps back up how you got to those numbers. So make sure that your budget is supported by a narrative, right, in a document that supports those assumptions. Next, you want to analyze and approve, right? So sometimes, you're in the thick of it, you're jotting things down, you're putting things together. You need to come back and look at it with a second, set of eyes, or a fresh pair of eyes, rather. So, you want to look over the details. Is there anything that doesn't make sense? Is there anything that's a red flag? You want to look at, that bottom number after you've accounted for your revenue, you've accounted for your expenses. What is the gap? What is the gap, and how do you plan to fill that gap? Are there additional fundraising campaigns that you think you're going to have to put on? Because if that's the case, then you have to go back to the budget, right, and account for, putting on those fundraisers. Are there expenses that are, associated with that? What are you expecting or estimating that you're going to bring in from those different fundraisers? And does that help close the gap? So making sure that as part of your analyzing the budget, that you've identified if there is a gap, and if there is, how you're going to close that. If there is not a gap, that's great, right? Kudos to you. Now you can move over to the approval process, right? Because the budget needs to be board approved. It also helps to have it board approved because that means that's another set of eyes. Questions can be asked to challenge your assumptions to make sure that the budget is really solid. So make sure after you've analyzed it, after you identify whether or not there is a gap and how you're going to close that if necessary, that you move on to the approval process and have the budget reviewed and approved by the board. And then finally, you want to make sure that after it's approved, that budget is uploaded into your accounting software. For us, we use QuickBooks Online with our clients, right? But then you also want to make sure that the budget is communicated to the necessary parties. Sometimes certain funders want to have your budget, on hand, right? You want to make sure the department heads have the budget, right? They may not be operating or working in fiscal, but they should have it so that they can determine, one, they can have it to refer to, but also so that they can determine, okay, we've said, we only get to spend X amount of dollars in this area. Let me be mindful of that, right? Fiscal is the person that is, of course, fiscal is the department, rather, that's tracking those things and making sure that the organization is operating within those lines. But it is good to make sure that the necessary parties, one, who have been a part of this process, right, gets to see the final product. And so you want to make sure that you have that given to them so that they can also have it to refer to. That is it for this video. The budgeting process can be very nuanced. It can be very tedious, and there may be some specifics that we didn't go over in this video because it's going to depend. I know that it depends is so annoying, but that's just the nature of the game, right, that we're in. So I hope that this video was helpful. But if you have any specific questions on anything that I've gone over, why we do things a certain way, drop them in the comments and I'll be sure to respond. I'll see you guys in the next video.